How's it going? Eulair here. Looking at the component testing, and right now we're gonna jump straight forward to this. So I'm just taking notes out of this particular course from Enterprise UI Development as a way to now understand what are the infrastructure needed to maintain all of this large code bases with a wide range of contributors in large teams. So, uh, thanks to Steve Kinney to actually make this in a much more friendly, approachable, and practical way. To understand what are the challenges, especially for now, enterprise, to manage all of this, particularly interface. In our case, the tool that we're going to use is React TypeScript testing library, VTest, as well as Playwright for E2E testing. And along the way, well, what maintainability means in the context of software, which is the ability to add, change, and remove, migrate, or do a refactor in your code base. So that's exactly what we start to look at this. Especially what are the basic stuff that we need to put in place. Or in this case, based on the pyramid of the Maslow pyramid, is what are the systems that we need to put in place as a way to now come up and solve now these problems. So what is the infrastructure needed to actually guarantee the particular goal, the maintainability? So we have now the testing, the component testing, or we have now the testing systems, the build system, as well as the static analysis, as well as some other components here, such as now, sorry, it's like now that we have these basic installations needed, what'll be is the process that we need to do, or the how-to, as a way to achieve that goal, as a way to make this particular, to make our application maintainable, right? So here in the process, do we have things like code review and blueprints and document designs, or design documents, right? And when as we do this process, the how to, there will be some recurring problems. So you have now patterns. So patterns like, hey, for example, on the architecture patterns, or the state management, or the abstractions we need to do. So all of this is just to describe this. So just to move on to what we really care about, which is in component tests. This course we first describe is what test is all about. So we're describing is a testing system, as well as the unit tests. What are the things that we need to work with, and that is using Jest, and we're going to test if a function works as expected. The environment that this will run, which is now JavaScript, and some of the greatest hits when using some of these most common methods, right? So such as to be close. What is the subtle difference in between them? What is the referential equality and value equality, such as shallow equality or deep equality, as well as the common patterns when it comes to write our tests, all right, or the practice that we need to have in place to write our tests. And that is, hey, if you're going to do that, initialize everything here, put at the setup first, then your update logic, your testing logic, and after all, and the bottom line, the the assertions, right? And how can we use now this as a way to come up with some particularly, or so how can we write this to test specifically functionalities, right? So to be equal, to be close. A very interesting thing from to be and to be equal is the referential equality and value equality. All right, to be equal, to contain, to match, to um, to be yeah, to match, to be close to for point integers, to throw, to contain, to be an instance of, to expect any, to object contains, and so on and so forth. And then how can we now integrate those particular tests, part of our CI/CD process, specifically with GitHub Actions, which is now the way of how, by defining a workflow that contains jobs that will be triggered based on events, on a list of events. It can be GitHub events defined on your repo, or schedule that you put in place, or also it can be is posted to an HTTP API, right? So for example, as a way to trigger is a webhook in another place. And how now, by defining all of this workflow, looking at the anatomy of this, and how this workflow runs in parallel by default, and this is made of steps that runs on a runner, right? So these steps are just bash scripts and or custom GitHub custom apps, which is just an abstractions of all of these repetitive and complex tasks that we need to do. So for example, clone a repo into the runner, or set up a build tool change for the environment, for your build environments, or set up an authentication for different vendor providers. All those recurring things now GitHub Action provide you, and they will be run on this runner, which is just a virtual machine that the GitHub Actions provide you as a way to run your particular tests, right? Either is build and test, most of the time is that, as a way to check that your change now doesn't break anything. And the most common case, or the most common use case for your workflows is that, well, you wanted to define that, for example, run the build and test on any VR, or when it on a production release, or on deploying to production, set up a release tag, okay, or you want to add a label when an issue is created, right? Another common use case is, for example, when you need to actually is push or publish your change to an NPM, because you now have your SaaS and the open source tools. So that's a way of how you can now automate that particular process. So this is CI/CD process. Is just this like an assembly line of how we can make sure the code quality, code contribution in large code bases. So this particular assistant that is quite relevant, but again, as we started to do, how can we do that? We get into the aspect of how can we now protect our branch, and that's when we get into the security and IT and compliance. So I'm not going to dive in too much, but it's important to describe that. There is also a particular doc that I wrote that. So yeah, if you can take a look at that. And what we really care for our case is what happens when we need to multiple jobs that is running in parallel, which is great. But you can imagine jobs that depend on another one, and how you can now speed up things here. For example, anytime you make a PR, right, or when you add new change to that, and that's what we have now, catching. And there are two types of catching using GitHub Actions. So you have now for dependency or for the artifacts. So dependency is for those files that are rarely changed, right? So catching for reusability. And the other is for artifacts, which is now the output that is generated sometimes for a workflow that you want to keep. So for example, anytime you build for a mobile or desktop apps, or you want to generate build logs, that's some of the use case for this. And how you can now catch things here is by saying, hey, let's go to use now the npm CI, which is part of the continuous integration, or this clean installation that you can instruct to your npm manager to run and say, hey, I would like to now on any testing platform or automation platform, I want you to run this command, which is something that we run on any of these platforms, so we can get the application from scratch, right? So we can get a fresh app. But because we don't want to actually do that every time for every change that we made, we want us to catch this. So instead of telling to npm, hey, I want you to now get a fresh start here, but instead of having to go out to make a network request and download all of these assets, I want you to go and check out this local cache, this local registries. Okay, good. That was quite interesting, the way how now this works and how this catching is per branch, that also can be used from several of your siblings for your child branches, but also have some sort of restrictions, especially in time. So your catch only gonna live for 7 days. Some condition applies. So the thing is that when you do this, you save yourself time, which is the most important aspect and factor that a computer science has, and humans. Good. So now this component testing, right, which is what we care about in today's video, is all about is pretty much if in our unit testing we have now this way of how we can make sure that this function do what it's supposed to do. All right. So what do you get? What do you expect to get in a function, right? So unlike unit testing, when do you get what you expect to get in a function? Now with components, it's all about how can we gain confidence in our UI development without having to figuring out how to run a full browser-driven interface or integrations, right? So because at the end of the day, we would like to now run all of our tests close to what the end user is going to be used, but because that's very expensive, because a lot of the time we don't own any of the companies, doesn't own any of the pieces that is along the infrastructure, not to mention the network or the browser or the OS, just to mention a few one. What happened is, well, now this particular way of testing our UI components using is VTest or any of testing library that provide you an environment to run this UI components in the DOM. There might be other applications that you can go with, for example, to actually test your UI elements in, for example, let's say desktop applications or for Java applications. Okay, hey, I want to now see how this we're gonna look like in this particularly UI. But in our case in the web, we have now this runtime, this environment where you're gonna run our tests here, and that is the GS DOM or the Happy DOM. So GS DOM is something that have over 10 years in the wild. I think this is something that is still being used. Okay. It is still being used. One of the things with this GS DOM is now, because it wants to imitate the behavior of the DOM without the user interface, it has a lot of things that we are not quite used in our component UI development, right? Or UI development or in our UI component testing. So this GS DOM, which is a great thing, we have now a lightweight version of this, which is called Happy DOM. So this is quite interesting, right? Very, very interesting, because look at what the GS DOM actually is doing, right? So by creating this GS DOM, okay, where you have now an object where you can have access to this, okay, and they say, hey, I'm going to create now this window, this DOM window document where you can now append elements to that, all right? So as you can imagine, as you think of the way of how now the DOM is structured, the class structure of the DOM, that you have now the nodes, and then that extend, and there are some other classes like text node that extend from the node, and also the HTML, and also the elements. And in the elements now you have this is a base class from other from other classes like HTML, MathML, or any other SVG or extendable markup language, right? And this also, the node has the HTML document that inside of this object has the window object. But the point of this is that there are several global variables that we can go with in JavaScript in this environment as a way to interact with the DOM, with this visual representation, or with this data representation, object programming representation of the elements on the page, right? So let's say paragraph, H1, this, so image, okay. So this is interesting. So now this exposes this document, the GS DOM. It exposes the document. So if you want to use that, all right, now because testing UI component is completely different than your unit tests, now we have this nice little wrapper, nice little library called testing library, where back in the old days we have to use something called Ensign to actually do that. But now Ensign is something that Ensign yes. Ensign is now the library that allows us upgrading from Ensign 2 or React later 16. So now Ensign is a way of how can we actually test this user interface, okay, that actually behave close to what the end users will expect. And because of that, so now we have this nice little wrappers that is not only works for the simple DOM elements, but also for other React or other UI frameworks. And here you have now React, Angular, Vue, Svelte, Marco, you name it, bro. There's a lot of it. So like this, this one, right? So you have now frameworks, which is an integration of this. So one of the cool thing of this testing library is that, especially if you're gonna use with a framework, which is in our case, like testing, so we can now wrap our components to expose a set of methods that we are now give us much more confidence to see that, to check not the implementation but the functionality. Okay, hey, for example, I want you to these components to get rendered on, so it is. Or I want you to now is if a particular content inside of this component actually is as expected. So that's why we started to use now that tag and that ID for that kind of stuff. That makes a lot of sense. To actually is decouple or test from the implementation. Interesting. So things start to make a lot of sense. And not only that, is that when it comes to use some of these particularly hooks or these specific features from UI frameworks, they also provide with that. In the case of React, it's because you have the render result, and all that kind of stuff, which is a great thing. Okay, similar for view tests, right? As you can see, the API, and not only that, okay, this also provides some of the core API, which is the ability to query elements in this DOM, pretty much like accessing to any of this DOM operation, but now they have a particular wrapper around this, as well as the user actions. And these user actions, okay, that can be is to most projects has few use cases for fire events, but the majority of them use now user event. So these user actions, right, will allow you to now is firing events, but firing the way how now the user does. So for example, like key up. So what are the things that key up needs to do? Well, that the user needs to key down first, and then key up. And this is just a couple way of to describe that. And these user actions, right? When you want to actually find that, this is also something that they mentioned here. Several utilities are provided for dealing with asynchronous code, and this can be useful to wait for elements to appear or disappear in response to an event. So user actions, timeout, or promise, like this. The async method return promise for that. So this is not the way of how can we get access to, for example, a button. Okay, and how we get access here by role instead of by ID, right? Especially because a button can have, you can actually define some sort of functionality here for that. That's also quite interesting here. Appearance and disappearance using find by queries. Okay, elements is initially not present, wait for appearance and return the elements, and then find by text the Lion King. Considerations for fire events, but most of the time, because okay, using fake timers, useful to actually see if so this UI has shown properly or not. So when using fake timers in your test, all of the code inside of your test use fake timers. The common pattern to set up fake timers is usually within the before each, and so on and so forth. So yeah, advanced accessibility, custom query. Okay, this is something that we're gonna see that later, all right, with accessibility. But again, so in today's video, it's just about getting ourselves familiar with this component testing library and what are the common things that we're gonna do, and how can we now, for example, is abstract things and checking now for if a component is rendered, if using now the user events or the user interactions, okay, and how you can set up that. Also for your inputs in testing and items in lists, test isolation and test scope, which is a great thing. Let's get into this. Let's get into this.
We're going to pull in render from testing library React. In fact, we're going to pull in everything. Yeah, we'll just do this for now. Render, and you have two choices how you do this. I'm going to do it. We decide at the moment. We'll do const, call it render component for a second, because can't have the same name. Which should take, if you look at render, it actually takes two arguments, which is borderline impossible to read, but if you squint closely, the first argument is that element, like we saw with counter, and the second one is some number of options, right? That one's pretty easy to type. The other one, render options with the generic of Q, and I think it also then takes out queries. I've looked at this before. So here we'll say React element, and then options. What is options? We'll deal with that in a second. I don't want to do this. I'll do it for a heartbeat. And all that we want to do in this case is when we say render component, with the component and all of those options, what I would like you to do is go ahead. In fact, we'll call it UI. We'll keep it the same as what they call it. Const result. We can refactor them. I'm live coding it. Where we will in fact render that UI with those options. We will also do that user event
for the user event. Yeah.
No, go away.
This kind of abstraction
dot setup
is something that is like I prefer.
Same thing we had from that other file, and then will we return everything in result plus the user. So now when I call render component, I will call render and also call user event setup at the same time, and I'll get both for free. We'll refactor that in a second. This is actually just a top level export. I'll refactor in a second, but we can go ahead and call this one render component. If you're like, no, I don't want to call it render component, I want to call it render, you have a few options for how you can handle this. You can say as make this one render component that you'll never use again, and this one can be render, right? And, they just can't be called the same thing at the same time. Now you will fight with IntelliSense later over this, but I am willing to have that fight and do it. So we still got to fix this. There's a few more things that we need to fix as well, but let's go back into our test. Oh, I do have a counter installed there, so you can see both. All right, cool. So here we've got, now what we can do is let's get rid of this render or heartbeat, and we'll have render, and you can see my one from this test utilities in this folder. What you angry about?
Because you haven't imported that?
So it gives me user, the container, the base, here's all the things. What you upset? Why are you mad?
Option. Oh, you didn't put options as optional?
Expected two arguments and got one. That technically makes sense. That is the code that I wrote.
Exactly.
So we can fix that. Because it doesn't know that that one is optional.
Exactly.
So we could say.
So this is optional.
And now it works.
Exactly.
Right. I can refactor this a bit. No, don't say that. Don't save any random things I wrote in any file. Okay. So we can refactor this a little bit here as well, which is this any will opt me out of any kind of sense of IntelliSense. So I have a few options here, which is I could do. There isn't a type that I can just export right now. As a moment that y'all are in the room and whoever's watching this as I record this, there's no type that you can import for what that option is because it's dynamically. So I could do get me the parameters
of the type of render.
Type of
render component.
So zero base. So this option should be whatever the second argument to the render from React testing library is. I don't know what that is, but that should be the same thing. Right, and that will do the trick. The only things that I would do here to make this a little bit easier, I did these to show you everything that we get from the results spread out in an object.
Yeah, this is more like a clever trick. But again, don't get too clever because it'll buy you. Don't get too clever because it'll buy you. So, because here, this is something that we're going to repeat over and over and over and over. Follow me. Follow me here. Follow me here. Follow me here. Okay. So here we are. Yes. Okay. So here we are, right? Because this is a way of how can we now is access to our elements here, okay? Screen is useful for debugging here. You're gonna take a look at that. So for example, if you say, hey, I would like to now say, say is like screen the debug of the document, which is something that you create by, right? And I want to is say, hey, document after, say, so before click, right? Before click, I don't think this is possible. Yep. It say before click is not assignable to a parameter. Okay. So can I pass an object here? Come on, man. Stop. Is it not assignable to okay, yeah, because it expect that. Okay. Well, doesn't matter. Document here. This one, then this one, right? Use this just for demo purpose to see that actually it will run as you can see this here, right? So now this is something that you can have access because GSDonk exposed this. This environment, when you create that, it exposes you for that, right? It's like, oh, okay, 0 initially, and then you have the different here is 1, right? Again, this is just for debugging purpose to see what in the F is going on, which is a great thing, but we are not going to use that. However, here, because what we're gonna do is just to wrap the thing as a way to see how now the render works and how you can work with types, which is another important thing of what we do in this. Remember, too much extractions is dangerous. Okay. So that being said, on the utilities, let me see, it's on the test. On the utility test, I think it's this. On the utility test, right? For a complete example, see test utilities. On the utility test, we can now instruct. Okay. We can now instruct. Okay. We can now instruct to the vtest to say, hey, now the setup file will be is now under the test setup here, like this, and then some utility that you can go with as it is, right? Oh, great! They already create this, but let's not go to with this, right? In fact, let me actually create this from the scratch by saying, hey, I want to create now a wrapper function here just to make, because we're going to reuse this. We're going to use this a lot. Okay, this is what we create here, our wrapper function called now render. Okay, where this render component, that'll be is the name of this, right? Or you can say is this, right? Just simple, without passing an anonymous function. Where here, this render function, at the beginning we don't know what is going to be accept. That's where we say, hey, I want you to import now is from the testing on the testing library in React this thing called render. Okay, and we can explore here render, the render as a render component. Okay, so now this render component, as you can see here, we got is a color, but it's not a user as a value. Is now say, hey, I'm expect a, there you got it. I'm expect a UI React element, which is great, and then something called is the render option, right? So what is the render option here? Let's get into this. So here we can say is, hey, because we are not creating is a wrapper around this function, okay? So you say, hey, UI will be is now the React element, React dot element, React element, okay? React dot element. So we can say, hey, please import from React is the React element, right? So we can say just like this, React element, all right? And the second argument is something called options, but we don't know what options are, right? It's like any. So for the sake of the example right now here, what we're gonna do is later on we're gonna solve this, but it say, hey, this render, we need to set up everything here and then expose an object that we contain is or recurring stuff or setup things, like you say, hey, this will be this will be is the user event. You can call this as it is, like user event, and then you say, hey, I want you to actually call the user event from the library dot setup. Okay, of course it will be complaint because you say, hey, what in the F is this? Define, make your mind. You say, hey, this is just user, all right? Also we can say is now, hey, I want you to is say user event as a user event user event library, right? It say, hey, I don't recognize this. You say, hey, I cannot recognize this. Because now we are importing is completely, is everything like so, right? Okay, so we can add an alias here. We can add as we imported, but not as a default. Okay, question is that can we import, exactly, can we import default and then he's going to understand the context and all that kind of stuff. Really? However, or if you want to use an alias, is this. Or what you can do this is to actually rename that. Okay. Thanks. This is powerful. Hey, please. This is powerful. So you can say is so you can say just like this. Import this as it is. User event. And then you say here user event as expected. And then you want is to actually see, hey, I want you to render this component, right? I'm gonna render this and call the render component, or the result here as the, hey, render this UI element. And after that, I want you to now return from this function is the user event what needs to return is whatever you get in the result, okay, and the user event. Oh, because this is the render component, like this, like so. Alright, so I want to expose all of this property here, and then the user event as it is, right? So far so good. The problem with options here is that we don't actually know what the option is. We say this is something called as, oh, this is render result. This now is the second option is something called render options. They contain this and container-based elements. So how can we just tell TypeScript to say, hey, I want to get this render option that I don't know what it is, just please get that, right? So one way to say is like get all the parameters, which is a helper function from type. You say get all the parameters from the type of render options, okay, yeah, from the render option here. Well, now this render option is not from here, it's in fact from the testing. Is a render options here. So we need to get all of the so type of render option key of type of render component second argument here. Render component second argument here. Render component second argument here. Okay, but render component second argument here. from the type of. Wait, what is this one? Okay. So here when you say, hey, get me is, this is when you can use this utility function in TypeScript to say, hey, give me is the render component parameters type the second position, right? I don't know when, but it's that. That's a clever motherfucker. That's a clever motherfucker. There's a clever things here. Exactly. Render option, type render option, you say, hey, this is give me the parameter of the render components. Give me now the types of this. Give me now the type of the parameters of this function in the second position. And then you do that. So this is quite interesting. Very, very, very interesting here. Very, very, very interesting here. And now if you want to make use of this, okay, you just only say, hey, let's go to now import that in our components.
Change this real quick. And we'll go ahead. Now I don't need this.
So you can say it's like, hey, instead of doing this, I just can now call is the, let's go to remove the render here. I can now call is the render for my utility function, test utility. What I'm going to pass now is the counter. Okay. And here I'm going to get is now is the wrapper from this, as well as the user. We say wrapper does not exist because you're passing is all of these things at once. So not only that, you say, hey, I'm gonna get is here the user. Okay, this is what happened, but not able to actually render this because here instead of using this, we use a screen for this. Why do we use a screen for this? All right. Exactly. Why do we use a screen for this particular case? Queries, user actions, advanced, custom queries, debugging. We use now a screen for that. Screen for the debugging here. For convenience, screen also expose the debug method. But you have also pretty dumb. So you have now also the screen. This is method is essentially a shortcut for console log, the pretty dumb, and this one. Okay. But with screen is using the from queries. Oh, because this is the way of how you can query that. Query that particular document. Okay, screen. You need a global DOM environment to use a screen. If you're using Jest, with test environment set to GSDOM, a global DOM environment will be available. Screen all the queries exported by DOM testing library as act as a container. That's the first argument. Because querying the entire document body is very common, DOM testing library also exports a screen object which has every query that is pre-bound to the document body using the within functionality. Wrappers such as React testing library re-export screens so you can use it in the same way. So this is a way of, this is a nice little wrapper around the document for our test environment.
Your next mission is, you've got this exercise right here. So ideally, Counter also takes information. So now we want to do it. If you did need to be somewhere,
Okay, so let's get into this. Absolutely. Let's do this. Which is on the counter exercise test here. Yeah. It should render the component, which is already there. This is a way of how you can wrap the document for this GSDOM. Okay. So we can have access to this current count like that. Hey, I expect you to have initially 0. It should render the component. It should increment when the increment button is pressed like this. That's right. So instead of actually using, hey, what the, this is, wait, what? Okay. And also is the counter test. Oh, and the counter exercise test here. That is like it should increment when the increment button is pressed, which is already done. Okay, we actually using this, but we can use the wrapper for that. And to use that wrapper, we say, hey, I want you to know import is the render from my utility function. It doesn't import that. That's right. I want to use the render for my utility function here. All right. And I want to get is now I want to render is a counter here. Okay. And now assign that to the user. So we can destructure this from that. Right. This user event. And that'll work as expected. Okay, so the other is that to do, it should render the component with an initial counter. It should render the component with an initial count. with an initial count. Define that initial count. So you have this counter component, all right, and also the counter svelts. But this is the counter component, okay. No, this is the counter component. Very straightforward and easy to set up, okay, nothing too fancy. And here you say it should render the component with an initial count. What in the F does it mean? And the other is it should reset the count when the reset button is pressed. It should render the component with an initial count. Oh, if you pass a parameter, makes sense. Jesus. If you pass, okay. So, exactly, it means that if we say, hey, I want to render these components that I pass here with a counter, okay, as initial count, which is the initial count, right? Unlike view, this is the way how you can have access to this, and you say, hey, let's go to pass now with 10, right? So you just, this is just for make your tests easy to read, right? Okay. Initial count here, and even though that it might be quite redundant here, but this is the initial count here, which is initial count 10. All right, so once you render this, after that, I want you to now wait for this. We need to somehow wait for this, because we say, hey, this is now the value that we're gonna pass. This is what you're gonna render, okay, and then I expect. I'm gonna put here now as the this is now our setup, okay, and this is now our assertion or testing logic, which is, hey, I expect, which is the current count, right? I expect that this screen the get by test ID here, because we assigned that label to that, the current count, all right, and I want to expect this current count, which is one of the nice little things of the testing library, is that expose here is already a nice little wrapper of our extent, but it does that because here in the setup we're saying, hey, I want you to now add to these matchers here. We want this to add these matchers here. So initially when it runs, of course it's add now this match to the expect, but this is on the setup function, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to actually do that. So that's what we have, for example, to have text content, to have text content to be is 10, or to be is now the initial count, right? Because now this is a number, we say, hey, what if we pass is now a string like 10. But now here we have is this particular issue. It's like, hey, this is not a number. I expect you to pass a number. So this is a number. We can say is hey, because after all you are now expecting is a string. What you can do is to say, hey, I want to transform now to a string. Say, hey, to string. And that's supposed to work as expected, right? Of course, it's not running this particular test. because the test that is running is on the, no, I don't want to pass in any of this flag, is on the counter.exercise.test. All right, and it passed as expected. That's right, and it passed. So we write our test for just these silly things that we need to in less than 10 minutes, which is exactly what actually all of these companies actually require you to say, hey, can you do this fast and reliable? Do you understand what we're doing? And all that kind of stuff. And the other test is, test to do, it should reset the counter when the reset is pressed. So let's get into this. Let's go to define now is the counter value, or the reset value. All right. The question is that to which value it should reset. You know what I mean? To which value it should reset. Okay. To set to count to 0. All right. We say, hey, reset value is 0. Again, the finding is now this developing the practice here of the discipline to write our test in this particular way. You define your set of stuff, then the testing logic, and lastly the assertion or expectations. So in our case, because we want to do this, we also want is to actually render that value. Say, hey, let's gonna render that value into this GSDOM instance of the what we're gonna render. The component itself, the counter here, okay, it will now expose is this user event, which is very useful, by the way. All of the user interactions that we can expose, that we can act on this component in React components, okay? So by the time we click this, we want is to actually check that value. So what we say, well, it's going to now is get that value, okay, which is the current counter, by saying, hey, because we have now this nice little function that allows us to inspect is the DOM elements, like screen, we can say get by test ID as a way to abstract is the test from the implementations from the functionality. So get that text by this current count, okay, and then we're going to define the testing logic, which is, hey, by the time I now click here, I click on the particular elements, all right, which is in this case the reset button, the reset button, okay, where you say, hey, please get me that element, but in this case get by role, okay, and that is the role of this button, which is the role of this button is increment is reset, right? The role of this button is reset, that match, okay, a particular name, okay, that match a particular name that we put in here, which is reset, and in this case get rolled by bottom that match with the name reset, okay. So once I click here, which is the reset button, okay, I will expect now the counter, which is now the end of our test, current counter, or in this case, I expect to the current counter, which is an HTML. Okay, I expect the current counter. All right. Okay. There's a couple of things that we can do here, right? You say, hey, it should reset the counter when the reset button is pressed. We can say, hey, we can pass as an initial count. Okay. You can say, hey, we can pass an initial count. All right. We can pass an initial count. All right. Which is initial count here. Initial count here. We can pass an initial count. It should reset the count when the reset button is pressed. Okay. And then by the time we reset that, we say, hey, good, because now we can actually check to see, hey, to have text content equal to the reset value, right? Reset value dot to string. So if we run this test, this say, hey, get by role. Okay, that's quite interesting. Why does it fail? Ignore notes, comment, script, and style. But yeah, we're able to find accessible elements with the role button. Really? And name reset. Okay, that's a more useful. That's a more useful completely. That's a more useful error message. Okay. Oh, it's because it is called reset. Oh, it's because it's called reset. That's what happened. Still throwing the same error. Okay. Run that again. It's exactly. It could find the get by role. Screen that get by role, the bottom, and the name increment, and here the name is reset, right? Perhaps the way how do I wrote this is quite different. Name dot reset, and then dot increment. If I say this. But it's say, hey, I couldn't find anything here. 400. Who in the fuck put you in 400? Who in the fuck put you in 400? No, it's here. Okay. Name reset. Okay. Name reset, my friend. Oh, this is interesting. This is camel case. Okay, this is interesting. And then you got it. So yeah, that may be one way of how you can solve this. Right? But the whole point of this is to try to resemble your test as it is. Ooh. Oh, you die. Ooh. Your servers are about to die, bro. What the French does happen here? Woo! Okay. And then we look at here at the counter exercise solution. Counter exercise and solution. But again, this is just for rendering components and interacting with this. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Extraction is the enemy of the good maintainable code. Oh, but this actually works. Why is this? Why this work? Oh, why this work? Isn't it supposed to work? Oh, because what in the F? Exercise.test. Example. Source example counter and exercise test.tsx. Why this is okay? It's like it resolved this without putting this. Exactly. What? Jesus. Is that another implementation that you can do with here? And then you say, hey, you know what? This will be is now a way for click, but click is the increment button. Increment button. where here you say is increment, and I want you to now increment that. Increment, and then you reset that. Is another thing that you can do is that, hey, I expect you to have now the value of 13. If I put 14, you should throw an error. That's right. Expect element to have text content and receive. That's right. Is that some regular expression here? Find anything that match here? Yeah. Yeah, it's actually doing partial match. Mm-hmm. The data field is much better for because you are extracting is a implementation of that. Exactly. Mm-hmm. That's one of the functional programming here. Okay, so it's to test these interactions here. Hmm. Mm-hmm. So add that. You're gonna add this thing. You can edit it here, save it. And so we do test this functionality here, but based on the user interactions here. Mm. All right. Okay. It's interesting because A lot of people actually. That's very interesting. A lot of people I don't know how to even build stuff, and that's one of the reasons why you are here, bro. You know what I mean? So that'll be all for this video. Take care. Bye bye.